affiliate for the Food Production Podcast. This is episode 88, July 12th, 2013, and this is part 10 of Permaculture Design. Today I was going to talk about natural systems, the principles of permaculture design, weeds also used as soil indicators, and extending your yield over time, which involves planting different varieties, having a diversity of crops, and also preservation. So let's talk a little bit about natural systems and the characteristics of natural systems. Now, in natural systems, in ecosystems, everything is complex. There's no simple system. Now, we make simple systems. When we do a monocrop cornfield, that's a simple system, but Mother Nature doesn't make simple systems. In natural systems, there's many connections, there's lots of diversity, and everything cycles through. There's nothing that is just going to live in that system for absolutely forever, and also there's nothing that's wasted. The things that die, we end up building new things on top of the things that died. So permaculture actually looks at the natural systems for the design model. So we're looking for that we're looking at those natural systems to mimic those systems. For example, my chickens that exist upslope from my terrace garden, they provide fertility that washes down the slope into the terrace garden. They also provide insect control by existing around the edges of the garden, preventing certain insects from getting in. They're also in my food forest / orchard, where they're benefiting from the fallen fruit. They're also fertilizing the trees and providing insect control for the trees. So those chickens are actually, there's many connections that they're providing there. And, also with diversity in permaculture, we've got, we're using a polyculture of plants and animals. We're not just planting one thing. We're not just doing a monocrop of corn. We're not just building chicken houses where we have 40,000 birds in them. We're doing a very diverse system where there's lots and lots of different plants, lots of different animals, lots of different trees, shrubs. So that's nature's way is to have a lot of diversity, and that makes for a much more stable, more productive system that requires less inputs. Now, in natural systems, soil is produced by the natural system. Nobody's bringing in mulch or compost or making compost piles or anything like that. In natural systems, there are certain types of systems that tend to grow soil production quicker than others or more than others. For example, your shallow marine mangroves and estuaries, they're producing soil faster than any other system in the world. Followed by shallow lakes and ponds, and obviously we're mimicking that by building shallow ponds and lakes and stuff like that. So we're mimicking that. Forests, that would be number 3. Those are great soil producing systems, and we're mimicking that with our food forests. Prairies and savanna rangelands, we're mimicking that with different grazing animals by paddock shifting, things like that. And then number 5 would be your mulched crop gardens, and now those would be the least productive of those 5, but still much more productive than a monocropped cornfield or soybean field or something like that. Another thing to understand is design. Typically, design is composed of 2 elements. It's going to be functional and it's going to have beauty, aesthetics. And the majority of what you see out there in typical landscape design, I would say 90% of that is based on looks. We're concerned with aesthetics. And that's what's important. We make it look pretty, the clients are happy, we get paid. But in permaculture design, we're much more concentrated on function. We're concerned with the function of it. We're concerned of the sustainability of it. So functional design is sustainable, and it's going to provide for its own need. It's going to produce a surplus yield or a very good product yield. And in my opinion, I know we're talking about functional design, and a lot of people say, "Oh, well, it probably looks ugly." In my opinion, if you do a very good functional design, I think it's actually very attractive because it makes sense. You start doing all these crazy, designs that are just basically for aesthetics. It might look good and be in fashion at the moment, but over time it's like, why did they do that? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's hard to maintain, doesn't produce anything. What's the point? So I really think that nature is something that has aesthetics. It's very beautiful, but it's also very functional. And I think we can certainly do that with our permaculture systems. There's no reason why it has to be functional only. Now, some of the principles of permaculture design that are really important to keep in mind when you're doing your designs is that each element that you have should have many different functions. And an element might be something like, a good example would be a chicken. A chicken's an element that you want to include. And what functions does the chicken have? Well, it provides light tilling, eggs, fertility. It provides insect control. It provides meat. It provides more chickens if you've got a rooster. Another good element might be a fruit tree. If you're going to plant a fruit tree, it'll provide feed for your animals. It'll provide a windbreak, shade. It could even provide a hedgerow, leaves for mulch, and obviously it can provide fruit to eat. So we plant these things, and they're going to provide multiple functions, and that's an important principle. We're not just planting something or adding an element to a design that only provides one function. Another thing that's important principle of permaculture design is that every function needs to be supported by more than one element. So, for example, a function might be fertility. So, we need fertility, that's a function, and we need multiple things providing for that one element, the fertility. So we've got our chickens, we might have nitrogen fixing plants and trees, we might be adding some leaf mulch and compost, we might be using wood mulch, we might have wild birds and animals that are providing fertility to the land. So it's important that we're thinking about each function being supported by more than one element. So for example, if you're out in monocrop corn country, there's nothing supporting the fertility there except for bringing outside inputs of nitrogen fertilizer in. So there's no element that's supporting that function at all. It's actually zero. And they're not even leaving the corn husks or anything, or any of the corn stalks or anything. So it's not even like they can get a little bit of fertility from that. They're removing that stuff too. So they have to take it all away and then bring it all back, which I guess works okay when you have surplus energy and you've got diesel fuel to burn in big machines. But if you're trying to do this in a sustainable way, it doesn't compute. It doesn't work at all. Another thing to keep in mind is that the reason why we want these functions supported by more than one element is because it helps to make the system more resilient. In a way, it makes kind of like a safety net. And the reason is because you always have a function met from many sources. So if one function fails, it's not a problem. Or if one of the sources fail, the function's not going to fail and ruin your whole system. So that's definitely a good thing, having a more resilient system, because there's going to be times where, for example, and this goes into diversity, which is also a principle of permaculture design. And the great thing about diversity is you've got different types and varieties of produce and animals that you're producing on your site. So you're growing all this different stuff, and if, for example, you have a bad year. For example, this year I've had good broccoli and strawberries and asparagus and lettuce and spinach, but I've been a little bit slower on, my peas were okay, not great. My peppers have been a little slow. My eggplant's been a little not great. So it's not like I'm not getting anything. I'm still getting a lot of yield. Who knows, next year maybe I'll get great production from the peppers. Last year I got better production from my tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant because it was warmer. This year the spring was a little cooler, so my cool season crops tended to do a little bit better. But it's important that you have a diversity of elements in your design. That way, regardless of what happens with the climate, what happens with certain pests, you're always going to have a pretty good yield. Like I said, there'll be certain years where some things do better than others, but you're not going to be that concerned because you're always going to have something that's going to be doing well and things that you can harvest. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was weeds. And weeds are something that people, they absolutely hate, they want to get rid of, but there's a reason why they're there. They're there because they're trying to build the soil to success to what it really wants to be. And in most of the northern climates, it wants to be forest. So we want to have these forested systems, and weeds are kind of the first step to getting to that point. So there is a weedy stage that it goes through. But another big benefit of weeds in a system is they can tell you a lot about the soil without actually doing a soil test. For example, if you've got a really compacted area of soil, which you can usually tell without even actually having weeds, but typically weeds with pretty deep tap roots will tend to grow. And what happens is the root kind of breaks the soil up, allowing water and nutrients to filter down, and this helps to repair the land. So if you've got a bunch of dandelions everywhere, chances are the soil is compacted. Now, if you've got sort of bushy, kind of herbaceous type plants with, and they have like kind of a hairnet type root, and these you tend to get in areas that have been plowed, because if your soil is too loose, these things will tend to come up. And I've noticed like oxalis is a good one. I like oxalis, and I think it actually tastes really good. But I've noticed and they have kind of a hairnet root. And if you've got an over rototilled area, you'll tend to get a lot of hairnet type roots. And to be honest with you, we really shouldn't be rototilling anyway. Another thing is if you've got an area that's depleted of potassium, which happens when you slash and burn, basically you'll tend to get plants like bracken ferns that will spring up after the fire, and they're sort of like digging down to try to harvest potassium to return that to the soil. So that's a good indicator of something that's been burnt. In areas that have been just overgrown, or not overgrown, but areas that you've overcropped, that you've grown too many nitrogen greedy type plants over and over and over again, you'll start to get a lot of legumes, nitrogen fixing type weeds, and they're just basically trying to repair the soil. So a lot of these weeds, they're trying to do you a favor. But I guess we want to conquer nature and have everything in order and in its nice place. And sometimes we have to stop and think about what the signs are telling us. Another thing that Jeff Lawton has kind of instilled in me in this class is he's talked a little bit about his mentor, which is Mollison, and Mollison has some the Mollisonian permaculture principles, which are kind of interesting, and they're ones that you've probably heard, and but they're important. And I think it's good to go through them again, and they're ones that you hear people kind of just say over and over again. One being, you're going to work with nature rather than against natural elements. So allowing your fertility to roll downhill as opposed to trying to pump it back up. There's lots of things that you can just sort of think logically and work with nature, and it just makes it so much easier. Another really famous one is the problem is the solution. For example, I have a good example of that. I felt like I have way too much lamb's quarters on my berms. And I'm like, I'll do it. I don't really want to go through and cut all of them down. What am I going to do with all those lamb's quarters? And I'm like, well, what are lamb's quarters really good for? They've got this, obviously it's tree spinach, so you could eat the leaves, but I'm never going to eat that much lamb's quarters. So, but they do produce a very high protein grain. And my chickens are going to be grazing in between the swales where all this lamb's quarter is. So I'm like, well, by the time the chickens are out there, the lamb's quarters will be starting to get mature, and what I can do is I can just start cutting them down wherever the chickens are and just throwing them in there and letting the chickens eat a high quality grain, and that's going to be an excellent food source for them, and it'll save me a little bit of money in feed, and the chickens will be healthier. So in that sense, the problem was the solution. The problem was too much lamb's quarters. Well, the solution is, that's great, I've got all those lamb's quarters, I can cut it down before it goes to seed and feed it to the chickens. And so we really have to kind of be creative in how we look at things and realize that a lot of times the problem is in fact the solution. So something that you view as a problem might actually turn out to be a positive resource if you can use it in a certain way. Another thing is to make the least amount of change for the maximum effect. And I think that's kind of important, because you can make a lot of you can end up making a lot of mistakes, and you don't really know where the mistake is if you're making enormous changes. If you can make sort of small changes, and that can create a big effect, I think that's probably where you start first in design. Let's see, another couple. There's no limit to richness in a design, only the imagination of the designer. So, and I agree with that. I mean, there really is a lot of imagination that you can put into these designs. You don't have to follow exactly, the template of, growing, food forests on swales and growing your zone 1 garden. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can make this work. And if you're dealing with different clients, they're gonna have all sorts of different ideas for what they want. And there's a lot of ways you can apply these principles to give them what they want. Another thing that's really interesting, you said everything gardens. So, in a way, that is true. Your plants garden, your animals garden, everything in a way is absolutely gardening. So, the last thing I wanted to talk about was having a yield over a period of time, whether that be planting different varieties to have a different yield at different times and or preserving. So this is definitely an important part of permaculture. And the idea is to be able to produce a lot of different types of food over a long period of time so that it's available. So ideally, the first thing is ideally you get as much fresh food during the season as possible for as long as possible, because fresh food is what's going to be the healthiest. So, for example, I mean, you could certainly plant, middle and late varieties of certain fruit trees, but you can also do that by planting lots of different varieties of shrubs and berries and vines and ground covers, and I mean, there's tons of different fruit that you can plant that comes at different times of the year. So, for example, the mulberries are great because mulberries come right after the strawberries, but before the blackberries and raspberries. So that's kind of a common dead period that you could have some fresh fruit. So I think it's important to have, and a lot of this takes care of itself just by having lots and lots of different variety. But if you don't have a lot of space, you might want to really think about, when certain things are supposed to come ripening, or when things are supposed to ripen. You might have to choose different varieties to space them out. But if you got a big property and you're planting lots of stuff, if you've got a lot of diversity, that's probably taking care of itself. You can also use a greenhouse to kind of kickstart the get your starts going, so you can get your produce a little bit earlier in the season. You can also select varieties of plant material that yield for long periods of time, and there's a lot of stuff out there that will kind of produce over and over again. Asparagus, in my opinion, is a really good one for that, because asparagus starts producing super early in the season, and then it also has a very, I'm still harvesting asparagus now. I've been harvesting asparagus for almost 3 months now. So that's a great crop to have. You can also increase diversity, not by just planting different types of actual plants and trees, but you can also learn a little bit more about the particular crop and figure out where you can use other products of the actual plant. For example, you might not realize that sweet potato, you can eat the leaves, or broccoli, you can actually eat the leaves. And then there are other plants where you can eat the roots. Chicory, you can eat the roots. Other plants, they have seeds that you can eat. Believe it or not, you can actually eat watermelon seed. I mean, it's actually good for you, believe it or not. I mean, it doesn't taste good to chomp on them, but they're not actually bad for you. Or how about pumpkin seeds? You can actually roast those. So you can do that with squash. So let's say you cook your squash and you've got all these squash seeds left over. I mean, obviously you can save some for your crop for next season, but you can also cook those, and they're really, really good for you. So using other parts of the plant that we don't typically think about will help to increase your yield and also increase the diversity of what you're getting. And a lot of times is that when you're harvesting the plants and you're eating the seeds, those seeds are usually very, very high in nutrient. Another technique is to you plant a lot of things like your potatoes your garlic, your any of your tuber type crops, your carrots, your parsnips, things that you can store and that are kind of self-storing. You can store them in a root cellar. In some cases, you can store them in the ground, but I like to store a lot of stuff in the root cellar. So that gives you cheap space. If you have a root cellar, you have cheap space to store lots and lots of things. But obviously, the other way to do this is you can also freeze and can. You can dry things. Again, we talked about the root cellar, but you can also ferment food. And I personally think it's good to get familiar with all of those different techniques. And we use a wide variety of everything. So it's not like you have to just dry, or you have to just freeze your food, or you have to just use a root cellar. I mean, I think that it's a good idea to get experience with all those things, and they all kind of have their place. And if you've got, and it's the same thing with using, for preservation, for that function, I have a lot of different elements that provide my preservation. So I've got a freezer, I've got a dehydrator, I've got a root cellar, I've got jars, I've got I've got the ground that I can store things in. I've got all sorts of things that multiple things that we can store things in. Another thing that is a good idea is to try to use more perennial food than annuals. One thing you'll notice in the very, very early spring, the first things that come out that you can harvest and eat are typically from perennials. So your asparagus, your strawberries, some of these things that come up right away, a lot of times are perennial type food. Now your annuals, you got to get started, they have to get established. It takes a little bit longer. So using more perennial food is a great way to not only enhance your food security, but also to extend your season. Anyway, that's going to be it for today, and I'll be back next week with the next part of Permaculture Design. Thank you for listening to the Food Production Podcast.